If you stay alive in markets long enough, you stop being impressed by the costumes. That is one of the few advantages of time. When I was young, every crisis looked new to me. The headlines were new, the people were new, the jargon was new, the television faces were new, the excuses were new, the products were new, the certainty was new, the fear was new. I thought each collapse belonged to its own era and had to be understood as a separate drama. I do not think that anymore. Now I think most financial crises are the same machine wearing different clothes. One decade it is inflation and banks. Another decade it is technology and paper wealth. Another decade it is housing and leverage. Then it is commercial real estate, private credit, AI, crypto, or whatever the culture needs to believe in. Next, the wrapper changes. The mechanism does not change very much. That is why I do not begin a financial analysis with the headline. I begin with the chain. The chain is what always matters. Too much money gets made available too cheaply. That easy money gets misallocated. Misallocated money inflates the wrong assets. Inflated assets attract weaker borrowers, weaker thinking, and weaker discipline. Then policy changes, rates rise, liquidity tightens, refinancing fails, or confidence breaks at that point. The public thinks the crisis began. It did not. The crisis began years earlier when the money got easy enough for people to stop respecting risk. That is what always happens before a financial crisis. And if you do not understand that sequence, you will spend your whole life being surprised by things that were visible long before they became loud. The material you handed me matters because beneath the personal stories it contains a real pattern. On the surface it looks like one man, remembering 3 separate collapses. If you read it lazily, you take away anecdotes. The 1980s were ugly. .com was speculative, housing crashed, rates moved, some people got hurt, some people made fortunes. That is not the real lesson. The real lesson is that the same behavioral and financial structure kept returning under different names. The first collapse came from inflation rates and banking fragility. Inflation ran hot enough to become a daily punishment. Interest rates rose to levels that made ordinary borrowing feel almost impossible. Depositors wanted more yield. Banks had already lent at yesterday's lower rates. Borrowers faced much uglier refinancing conditions. The spread inside the banking system turned poisonous. Banks failed, consumers hurt. Unemployment rose. Main Street and Wall Street felt the same pain from different directions. Fay file site Fayturn 59 file 0 Fay. Most people looking backward at that period say something simple. It was an inflation crisis. That is true. It is also incomplete. It was not merely inflation. It was a sequence. Government looseness, monetary looseness, and a changed currency regime had already planted the conditions. Too much money had already entered the system. Inflation then became visible enough that the Federal Reserve had to respond brutally. That response did not create the fragility. It exposed the fragility that easy conditions had already built. That distinction matters. The easy money phase always feels like help. That is why it is so politically popular and so financially dangerous. When money is abundant, people feel relief first and risk later. Borrowers borrow institutions, lend, asset owners cheer, politicians congratulate themselves. Very few people say, while it is happening, that they are planting the seeds of a later purge. They say the opposite. They say growth is back, opportunity is open, the system works. Then inflation arrives, and the cure becomes harsher than the pleasure that created the disease. Now the central bank tightens, rates rise, and a whole world of structures built under easier assumptions starts discovering that it was never as strong as it looked. That is the first enduring crisis pattern. Easy money always creates future pain somewhere. Not because money is evil, because human beings treat the price of money as moral permission. If borrowing is cheap, they assume borrowing is wise. If financing is easy, they assume expansion is safe. If rates are low, they start to believe low rates are a climate instead of a temporary weather pattern. That is how systems get fragile. A bank that borrows short and lends long looks sound until its funding cost rises above the yield locked into its old loans. Then what looked like a stable institution becomes a slow accident. A borrower who took out debt at rates that seemed harmless can look prudent until he must refinance at something much worse. Then the loan reveals what the earlier environment concealed. That is why I say every crisis begins in mispriced assumptions, not in the final panic. In the assumptions, the next lesson came from the dot-com collapse. Again, the casual reader sees a totally different world. The 1980s hurt banks, borrowers, and ordinary people broadly. Dot-com looks like a paper asset crash. It looks like a mania in which people abandoned profits and bought pure story. That is true too. But the same sequence lived underneath it. Easy confidence, a new narrative strong enough to suspend discipline, prices running far ahead of economics. Participants arriving not because the assets earned money, but because the assets were going up. Fay file site Fay turn 59, file 0 Fay, that is one of the clearest danger signals in all of finance. When buyers stop asking what something earns and start asking only whether someone else will pay more later, the structure has already begun rotting. This is not confined to technology. It happens in land, in housing, in crypto, in venture capital, in collectibles, in AI when enthusiasm outruns margins. It is a human pattern, not a sector pattern. A good story arrives, then the crowd arrives, then prices rise because the crowd arrived, then the crowd uses the rising prices as proof that the story must have been right. That is how bubbles manufacture their own authority. People think the rising price is confirming the thesis. Often the rising price is only confirming demand for the thesis. These are not the same thing. The dot-com era taught one of the most valuable lessons in finance. A paper asset can rise for years on hope and then lose trillions when the market remembers that hope is not the same thing as earnings. The public always falls in love with growth because growth is easier to sell than discipline. Discipline sounds dull. Growth sounds like the future. But the future can be overfunded. A real idea can still become a terrible investment if the price outruns the reality by too much. That matters now because every era believes it has found the exception. The internet was supposed to change the old rules. Later people thought crypto changed the old rules. Today many speak about AI with the same emotional structure. Perhaps the technology is real, fine. The question in finance is never only whether the technology is real. The question is what price the market already attached to it, what capital it attracted, and what broader story now depends on it staying expensive. That is the sequence lesson again. A good idea becomes a growth story. A growth story becomes a market darling. A market darling becomes a concentration engine. A concentration engine begins carrying too much of the mood of the whole market. Then weakness there becomes systemic because too much belief was stacked on the same pillar. That is how excitement becomes fragility. Now comes the part most people still do not understand properly. The dot-com crash did not simply end a bubble. It also triggered the policy response that helped create the next one. This is one of the most important lessons in the whole document. People think crisis response means the authorities are cleaning up the mess. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are merely moving the risk into a new room. After a speculative crash, authorities fear deflation, recession, job losses, collapsing confidence, and political backlash. So they reach for the tool they know best. They cut rates. They make money cheaper. They try to restart lending, spending, borrowing, and asset formation. This can stabilize a bad moment. It can also sow the next bad decade. Faithful site Fay turn 59 file 0 Fay a rate cut is not neutral. It is an invitation. It says to the system, money is cheap again. Try again. The system always does. So after one bubble collapses, the next bubble often grows where money now flows easiest and where policy and politics can wrap the new excess in a noble story in the housing cycle. That noble story became home ownership. The public was told that more people should own homes, that lower rates and looser access were helping families, helping communities, helping society. Again, as with all durable traps, the story contained enough truth to be morally persuasive. Of course, more people wanted homes. Of course, lower rates made homes feel affordable. Of course, politicians loved the optics. Fay Falicite, Fay turned 59, file 0 Fay, but affordability. Built on cheap money and weak standards is not real affordability. It is borrowed affordability. The person thinks he can afford the house. Often what he can afford is the teaser version of the house under one specific rate environment. Then the environment changes. Then the bill becomes honest. Then millions discover the difference between a payment they could carry for a moment and a structure they could truly own through a cycle. That is what made the housing collapse so brutal. It was not only about houses, it was about a whole country mistaking easy financing for genuine capacity. And once again, the sequence repeated: easy money, policy encouragement, broad participation, weak discipline, then rates, resets, defaults, inventory, falling prices, bank pain, and a giant transfer of ownership from weak hands to strong hands. That is another crisis pattern few people appreciate while it is happening. When the crisis gets bad enough, prices do not simply fall. Ownership changes hands. The public experiences pain. The prepared experience terms. That is a hard sentence. But it is true. If you had no cash, no reserves, no network, and no courage during the last great housing collapse, then you experienced the crisis as danger. If you had liquidity, stable financing, and a stomach for buying what fear had repriced, then you experienced the same crisis as opportunity. This is why I tell people the biggest difference between those devastated by cycles and those enriched by them is not prediction. It is preparation. Prediction is overrated. Preparation is decisive. Now, let us stay on that because it is the heart of the entire piece. The ordinary investor wants to know which crisis comes next. I understand that curiosity. It is not the best question. The better question is whether your life and capital are structured so that when the next crisis arrives, you will be the forced seller or the voluntary buyer. That is the real line. Because once you understand the sequence, the task becomes much clearer. You do not need to predict the week. You do not need to know the exact top. You do not need to become a doom prophet. You need to watch the same signals. Has money been too easy for too long? Has the public begun treating low rates or loose credit as normal? Are buyers asking fewer questions about profits, cash flow, and real underwriting? Is a policy response to one crisis obviously inflating another area? Are large numbers of people being pulled into ownership structures they do not truly understand? Are prices rising faster than the economics justify? Is the crowd more focused on participation than valuation? Are governments or central banks using emergency tools again to preserve calm? Those are the right questions. The answers do not guarantee perfect timing. They do give you a map, and maps matter far more than predictions. The material you gave me also contains something even more important than the historical examples. It contains the practical lesson that by the third cycle, a person can stop merely surviving and start deliberately positioning. That is how real financial maturity works. The first cycle frightens you. The second teaches you that the first was not an accident. The third gives you a chance to act differently. If you respected the earlier lessons enough to change your behavior, that is what real cycle wisdom looks like. Not quoting old charts, changing how you hold cash, debt risk, and courage. I have long believed that liquidity is one of the most underrated assets in the world. In booms, cash looks stupid. It looks lazy. It looks like missed upside. That is why almost no one wants to hold enough of it. But in downturns, cash becomes optionality. Cash becomes patience. Cash becomes the right not to sell into panic. Cash becomes the ability to buy when fear has finally repriced the thing correctly. This is why crises always end up transferring wealth toward those who had liquidity before the panic became obvious. That is not unfair in the sentimental sense. It is just how arithmetic works. The seller needs to sell now. The buyer does not need to buy now. That difference alone is worth millions in a real cycle. The second underappreciated asset is emotional stability. The crowd always thinks crises reward the smartest person in the room. Sometimes they do. More often they reward the person who can think while others are reacting. The best opportunities almost never feel safe in real time. They feel uncomfortable, lonely, ill-timed, or slightly insane. That is why the public misses them. The public wants the signal that it is safe to buy. By the time that signal arrives, the best prices are gone. This is why I say investing is 10% math and 90% psychology. The math may tell you a property is underpriced, a stock is attractive, a business is sound, a balance sheet is survivable, and a cycle is turning. But if your psychology cannot hold steady while the headlines are ugly, the math does not matter. You will not act, or worse, you will act in the wrong direction. Then there is the third asset, pattern recognition. This is what age is really for in markets, not cynicism, pattern recognition. You start seeing that politicians always talk about affordability near turning points. You start seeing that central banks always seem tempted to use today as medicine without fully admitting the side effects that will follow. You start seeing that borrowers always assume refinancing will remain possible longer than it does. You start seeing that public narratives around assets become most moral and most flattering near the point of maximum fragility. You start seeing that the language of every boom tries to turn leverage into wisdom. Once you see this enough times, you stop falling in love with the present story. You ask what the current story is hiding. That is a much better habit. Right now, if you ask me what the lesson is, I would put it this way. Every financial crisis begins when too much capital is invited into a structure that only works if current conditions remain easy. Then the conditions stop remaining easy. That is the whole thing. The 1980s taught this through inflation rates and bank funding stress. The dot-com era taught it through profits abandoned for story. The housing collapse taught it through cheap debt, political permission, weak credit, and refinancing failure. Today, if you want to use the map honestly, you would watch where the money has been too easy, where narrative has outrun underwriting, where refinancing assumptions look fragile, where commercial real estate loans are hitting new rate realities, where private credit is pretending to be safer than its actual liquidity allows, where AI valuations are carrying too much optimism, and where governments are once again tempted to push rates lower to preserve confidence, even if that only seeds the next excess. That is where the tea leaves matter. This is also why I never tell people to wait for the exact bottom. The exact bottom is for ego structure, is for wealth. If you can identify when the cycle has clearly repriced quality assets into irrational fear, you do not need perfection. You need dry powder, patience, and the willingness to buy what the crowd hates, for reasons the crowd will later struggle to explain clearly. That is the hidden law of cycles. When the headlines are worst, the arithmetic is often best. That does not mean buy every falling thing. It means learn to separate the asset merely repriced from the asset that was rotten all along. That separation is where fortunes are made, and it cannot be learned from one slogan. It comes from studying enough cycles to see what was temporary and what was terminal. If I had to summarize the whole lesson in one clean sequence, I would say this. First, easy money or easy credit changes behavior. Second, changed behavior pushes capital into the wrong places. Third, rising prices make the wrong places look right. Fourth, more people join because the rise itself becomes proof. Fifth, discipline deteriorates because the environment appears forgiving. Sixth, the central bank or the market changes the cost of money. Seventh, weak borrowers or weak structures cannot refinance or endure. Eighth, panic reveals what optimism concealed. Ninth, policy responds. 10th, quality assets change hands from weak owners to strong ones. That is what always happens before a financial crisis, and during one. The details change. Human behavior does not. That is why studying these events is so valuable. Not because it makes you interesting at dinner, because it can stop you from becoming one more casualty of a pattern that repeats in full public view, while most people still somehow manage to call it surprising. There is one final thing I want to say. Do not study crises in order to become a pessimist. Permanent pessimists are not useful allocators. They see danger everywhere and eventually miss life itself. Study crises so you can become harder to fool when the next comforting story arrives. That is a much better use of memory. The point is not to say no to every cycle. The point is to know where you are in the cycle, what assumptions are supporting prices, and whether you are standing with liquidity and patience or with debt and hope. That is the real divide. Everything else is costume, and markets, if you stay around long enough, are mostly costume on top of behavior. Behavior is what counts. It always was. There is another reason this pattern repeats so cleanly, and it has less to do with economics than with human nature. People do not like explanations that reduce their sense of innocence. They prefer to believe that crises arrive from somewhere outside the ordinary life they were living. A bad president, a bad banker, a foreign war, a virus, a surprise. Anything but the harder truth, which is that for years they were surrounded by signals that easy money was changing behavior, that standards were falling, that prices no longer matched reality, and that everybody in the room was pretending this was simply the new normal. That is why the final break always feels unfair. It is unfair. But it is not random. The market spends years inviting weak hands into weak structures and then acts shocked when those hands begin shaking. That is the emotional core of every cycle. The reason I care so much about teaching this is not because I enjoy the pessimism of it. I do not. It is because once you see the pattern enough times, you stop needing the world to reassure you before you prepare. You no longer need the newspaper to confirm that risk exists before you trim it. You no longer need the crowd to approve caution before you build reserves. You no longer need the perfect headline to start getting your psychology, liquidity, and standards in order. That is a tremendous advantage because the public always gets the lesson late. It gets the lesson after the rates have already moved, after the refinancing window already narrowed, after the defaults already started, after the good assets have already been marked down by frightened sellers, after the strong buyers have already started moving. That is why I would much rather live with a clear map than a soothing story. A soothing story helps you sleep until the break. A clear map helps you act when the break comes. And in markets, action taken from structure is worth far more than comfort taken from ignorance.